The Americans landed in Ouagadougou with a briefcase full of desperation and a plan so audacious it bordered on insult. Revive the man Traore throughout. Paul-Henri Damiba, the same leader Burkina Faso rejected. The same figure who couldn't stop the violence, couldn't challenge France, couldn't protect sovereignty. And now, after sanctions failed, after Russia moved in, after the entire Sahel slipped through Washington's fingers like sand, the United States arrives, not to negotiate, but to resurrect a puppet. Traoré's response wasn't diplomatic. It was a declaration. Because this wasn't about one delegation or one country. This was about whether Africa would ever again allow foreign powers to choose its leaders. What happened in that room will decide the future of the entire region. The delegation stepped off the plane in Ouagadougou under a sky heavy with questions Washington didn't want to ask out loud. An emergency American diplomatic mission to Burkina Faso, a country the U.S. sanctioned, isolated, and publicly condemned just months prior, was not supposed to happen. But it did. And the timing reveals everything. Because this wasn't diplomacy. This was damage control. The United States, watching its influence in West Africa collapse in real time, had arrived in the Sahel not as a partner, but as a power in retreat, scrambling to salvage what little leverage remains in a region that has fundamentally rewritten the rules of engagement. For decades, the Sahel was understood through a familiar framework. Fragile states, Islamist insurgencies, French military operations, American drone bases, and a quiet but pervasive assumption that Western powers would always hold the cards. That framework is dead. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, three nations that once hosted Western troops and accepted Western aid under conditions shaped in Paris and Washington, have formed the alliance of Sahel states, expelled foreign forces, turned to Russia for security, and embraced China for infrastructure. They did this not in a vacuum, but in direct response to years of patronizing diplomacy, conditional support, and partnerships that prioritized Western strategic interests over African sovereignty. And now, with the region slipping irreversibly beyond its reach, the United States has been forced into a humiliating reversal, showing up uninvited, seeking dialogue with leaders it spent years trying to undermine, and hoping to claw back influence in a region that no longer needs its approval. At the center of this geopolitical earthquake stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's 36-year-old military leader, who came to power in September 2022 through a coup that wasn't just about removing a president. It was about rejecting an entire system. Traoré's rise was born out of fury. Fury at the failure of international partners to stop jihadist violence that had killed thousands and displaced nearly 2 million. Fury at a government that seemed more concerned with maintaining Western favor than protecting its own people. Fury at a security arrangement that kept Burkina Faso dependent while insurgents operated with impunity. When Traoré and a group of young officers overthrew Paul-Henri Damiba in 2022, they weren't simply changing leadership. They were signaling the end of Burkina Faso's willingness to play by rules written elsewhere. Damiba himself had come to power earlier that same year in January, ousting democratically elected President Marc Christian Kabore, citing the same grievances: insecurity, ineffective governance, inability to confront terrorism. But Damiba's tenure lasted barely 8 months. Why? Because he represented continuity disguised as change. He maintained ties with France. He kept channels open with the United States. He attempted to reform the system without fundamentally challenging the external dependencies that had paralyzed it. Traoré saw through it. So did the Burkinabe population. The second coup wasn't about ambition. It was about conviction. A belief that real sovereignty required severing the strings, not just loosening them. Washington's response was swift and predictable. Sanctions, visa restrictions, arms embargoes. The United States condemned the coup, suspended certain forms of assistance, and made clear that unless Burkina Faso returned to constitutional order, meaning implicitly a system more amenable to Western influence, relations would remain frozen. It was the textbook playbook. Isolate, pressure, wait for collapse, then offer conditional re-engagement. Except this time, the playbook failed. Burkina Faso didn't collapse. It pivoted. Within months, Traore had formalized the AES alliance with Mali and Niger, two countries that had followed nearly identical trajectories: coups, Western condemnation, expulsion of foreign forces, and strategic reorientation toward Moscow and Beijing. Together, these three nations represent something Washington has struggled to comprehend: a coordinated, ideologically driven rejection of the post-colonial security architecture that has governed the Sahel for generations. Russia moved in quickly. Where the United States hesitated and France withdrew, Moscow offered Wagner Group mercenaries, arms, training, and most importantly, no lectures. No conditionality tied to governance reforms or human rights benchmarks. No insistence on elections or transparency. Just security support in exchange for access, influence, and alignment. For leaders like Traore, the appeal was obvious. Russia didn't care about democratic processes. It cared about results. And in a region where jihadist attacks had become routine and Western partners seemed more interested in political theater than tactical support, results mattered more than rhetoric. China followed with infrastructure deals, mining contracts, and economic partnerships that came without the moralizing tone that had long characterized Western engagement. The message from the AES was clear: we will work with anyone who respects our sovereignty and delivers on commitments. What we will no longer tolerate is dependence dressed up as partnership. The consequences for the United States have been devastating. American influence in the Sahel, once anchored by drone bases in Niger, intelligence sharing agreements, counter-terrorism funding, and diplomatic leverage across the region, has evaporated. Niger, which hosted a major U.S. airbase in Agadez used for surveillance and strike operations across West Africa, demanded American withdrawal in 2024. Mali, which once cooperated closely with U.S. Special Forces and intelligence units, severed ties entirely. Burkina Faso, which had received American training and equipment for its military, turned to Russia for arms and operational support. In less than 2 years, the United States went from being a dominant security partner in the Sahel to an irrelevant bystander, watching Russia and China consolidate influence in a region Washington once considered strategically critical. And this is where the emergency delegation becomes so revealing. Because the decision to send American diplomats to Ouagadougou wasn't driven by a sudden commitment to dialogue or mutual respect. It was driven by panic. Reports suggest the delegation's mission included not only opening channels with Traore's government, but also quietly exploring options to rehabilitate figures from the old order, most notably Paul-Henri Damiba, the leader Traore overthrew. The implication is staggering. The United States, unable to work with Traore, appears to be testing whether it can revive a more pliable alternative, someone who might restore a version of Burkina Faso that Washington finds easier to manage. It's a strategy that reeks of desperation and a dangerous misreading of the political reality on the ground. Damiba is not a popular figure in Burkina Faso. His brief presidency is remembered not as a genuine break from the past, but as a failed attempt to preserve the status quo under new management. He didn't expel foreign forces. He didn't challenge French or American influence. He didn't fundamentally restructure Burkina Faso's security posture. And, critically, he didn't stop the violence. Traore did what Damiba couldn't or wouldn't do. He took radical steps. He ended France's military presence, forged the AES alliance, brought in Russian support, and framed the entire transition as a fight not just against jihadism, but against neo-colonialism itself. To suggest, as the American delegation reportedly did, that Damiba could or should return is to ignore why Traore is in power in the first place. It's also a profound insult. It signals that Washington still views Burkina Faso as a country to be managed, not a sovereign state with its own agency, interests, and leadership. Traore's response left no room for ambiguity. He made clear that Burkina Faso's sovereignty is non-negotiable, that the era of puppets and proxies is over, that any foreign power-seeking partnership must come as an equal, not as a patron. His rhetoric has been consistent since taking power. Burkina Faso will not return to a system where its leaders are selected, supported, or removed based on their willingness to accommodate external pressures. He has framed the AES alliance not as anti-Western, but as pro-African, a bloc built on the principle that African nations have the right to choose their own partners, define their own security strategies, and reject arrangements that prioritize foreign interests over domestic needs. This is not isolationism, it's assertion. What makes this moment so significant is that Traoré is not alone. Across West Africa, a generation of leaders, activists, and populations are questioning the legitimacy of institutions, alliances, and dependencies inherited from the colonial era. ECOWAS, the economic community of West African states, is fracturing. Once seen as a stabilizing regional bloc, it is now viewed by many in the Sahel as an extension of French and Western influence, more interested in enforcing compliance than defending sovereignty. The AES withdrawal from ECOWAS was not just a bureaucratic exit. It was a symbolic rejection of a regional order perceived as compromised. And it has resonated. Public opinion in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso overwhelmingly supports the shift away from France and the West. Street protests in Ouagadougou and Niamey have featured Russian flags not because of admiration for Moscow, but as a symbol of defiance against decades of Western dominance. This is where the stakes become clear. The emergency delegation to Burkina Faso is not just about one country. It's about whether the United States can adapt to a new reality in Africa, a reality where American influence is no longer assumed, where African leaders are willing to walk away from Western partnerships, and where rival powers like Russia and China are offering alternatives that, flawed as they may be, come without the historical baggage and political condescension that have defined Western engagement for generations. Washington's instinct has been to double down, more sanctions, more isolation, more pressure. But the Sahel has shown that this approach no longer works. Sanctions didn't weaken the AES, they strengthened it. Isolation didn't destabilize Traoré, it validated his narrative. Pressure didn't force capitulation, it accelerated the pivot to Russia and China. And herein lies the deeper crisis facing American foreign policy. For decades, the United States operated under the assumption that it could shape outcomes in Africa through leverage. Economic, military, diplomatic. But leverage only works when the other side needs what you're offering. The Sahel no longer needs Western security support because Russia is providing it. It no longer needs Western infrastructure investment because China is building roads, ports, and energy projects. It no longer needs Western diplomatic validation because regional and global public opinion, particularly among younger populations, increasingly views sovereignty and self-determination as more legitimate than alignment with former colonial powers. The tools that once gave Washington influence, conditionality, sanctions, military aid, have become liabilities. And the United States, slow to recognize this shift, is now scrambling to recover ground it didn't realize it had already lost. The visit to Ouagadougou is humiliating precisely because it exposes this miscalculation. The United States didn't arrive as a partner with something valuable to offer. It arrived as a power that belatedly realized it had been outmaneuvered, hoping to salvage relevance through gestures that might have worked a decade ago but fall flat today. Traoré's refusal to entertain any discussion of rehabilitating Damiba or reverting to the old system is not ideological rigidity. It's strategic clarity. He understands that credibility in the Sahel is earned through consistency during hardship, not opportunistic engagement after failure. Washington imposed sanctions when Traoré needed support. Russia provided weapons when Traoré needed security. China built infrastructure when Traoré needed development. Now, with the region stabilized under new partnerships, the United States wants dialogue. But dialogue requires trust, and trust, once broken, is not easily restored. What happens next could redefine the region. If the United States continues to approach the Sahel with the same assumptions, that pressure will eventually force compliance, that African leaders can be managed through a combination of incentives and threats, that Western partnerships are inherently superior to alternatives, it will continue to lose ground. Russia and China are not better partners in any moral or ideological sense. They bring their own agendas, their own exploitation, their own risks. But they have understood something Washington has not, that African leaders, particularly those who have risked their careers and lives to assert sovereignty, value respect and consistency over paternalism and conditionality. This doesn't mean the United States is permanently locked out of the Sahel. It means the terms of engagement have fundamentally changed. Any future American influence will have to be built on genuine partnership, not assumed dominance. The emergency delegation's arrival in Burkina Faso will likely be remembered as a turning point, not because it succeeded, but because it laid bare the collapse of an era. For generations, Western powers could dictate the terms of Africa's security, development, and governance. They could sanction governments, support coups, prop up allies, and expect compliance. That system is dying. The AES alliance, Traoré's defiance, and the broader shift across West Africa represent the emergence of a new order, one where African states are willing to endure isolation, sanctions, and condemnation in exchange for autonomy. One where loyalty is not guaranteed by history or aid, but earned through respect and reciprocity. One where the United States must compete for influence rather than assume it. Traoré has made his position unmistakable. Burkina Faso will not be a client state. It will not accept partnerships that come with strings attached. It will not allow foreign powers to dictate who leads, how governance is structured, or which alliances are permissible. This is not a rejection of the West as a concept. It's a rejection of the West as a master. And that distinction is critical, because it leaves open the possibility of future cooperation, but only on terms that acknowledge Burkina Faso as a sovereign equal, not a dependent. Whether Washington can accept those terms remains an open question. The scramble to recover influence in the Sahel reflects a broader reckoning for American foreign policy. Across the global South, countries are watching this unfold. They see a region that defied Western pressure and survived. They see leaders who rejected conditionality and found alternatives. They see populations that celebrated sovereignty over stability. And they are drawing conclusions. If the United States cannot adapt, if it cannot move beyond sanctions, leverage, and paternalism, it will continue to lose ground not just in West Africa, but everywhere African, Asian, and Latin American nations are reassessing their relationships with traditional powers. The Sahel is not an isolated case. It's a preview. The delegation has returned to Washington. The meetings have concluded. The diplomatic cables have been sent. But the fundamental question remains unanswered. Can the United States engage with Africa as it is, rather than as it wishes it to be? Can it accept that sovereignty, even when exercised by leaders it disapproves of, is legitimate? Can it compete for influence without resorting to coercion? Or will it continue to treat African nations as arenas for great power competition, where local agency is an inconvenience to be managed rather than a reality to be respected? The answer will determine not just America's future in the Sahel, but its relevance across a continent that is done waiting for permission to chart its own course. Traoré has drawn the line. Respect is earned during hardship, not demanded after failure. And in the new Sahel, any power seeking influence must come as an equal, or not at all.